Imagine stepping onto a ship, waving goodbye to the people you love and simply never coming back. No warning, no mayday call, no wreckage washing ashore, just silence. Total absolute silence where 34 human lives used to be. The Atlantic Ocean is vast, it is deep, and it has kept secrets that no government investigation, no search team, and no amount of modern technology has ever managed to pull back to the surface. This is not fiction. This happened. And to this day, nobody knows what happened to the SS Poet. There is a particular kind of dread that comes with a ship disappearing at sea. It is not the sharp shock of a plane crash. It is not the visible horror of a building on fire. It is slower. It is the growing realization over days and then weeks that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. That the silence on the radio is not a malfunction. That the ship is not simply running late. For the families of 34 men aboard the SS Poet, that realization came gradually and then all at once. Wives stopped sleeping. Parents started calling government offices. Children who were old enough to understand began quietly preparing themselves for the worst. And still, the ocean gave nothing back. The SS Poet was not a small vessel. She was 522 feet long, built in 1944. A veteran of decades of commercial shipping. Her crew was experienced. There was no visible, logical reason why this ship should not have made it to Egypt without incident. And yet, somewhere between the American coastline and the other side of the Atlantic, the Poet and everyone aboard her simply ceased to exist. To understand what happened to the SS Poet, you have to understand the world she sailed in. By 1980, American commercial shipping was struggling. The industry was aging, underfunded, and under enormous pressure. Many vessels still operating were decades old, patched up and pushed back into service because building new ships was expensive and demand was constant. The Poet herself was 36 years old by the time she made her final voyage. She had been built during World War II as part of a massive government shipbuilding program designed to keep supply lines open across the Atlantic. After the war, ships like her were sold off into commercial service. Workhorses of the open ocean, dependable but aging. Her final cargo was 13,500 tons of corn, loaded in Philadelphia, bound for Egypt as part of a government food aid program. Routine work. The kind of voyage experienced merchant sailors did without giving it a second thought. The crew she carried reflected that ordinariness. These were working men, engineers, deckhands, officers, cooks. Men with families waiting at home. Men who had crossed oceans dozens of times before and always came back. On October 24, 1980, the Poet cleared the Delaware Bay and moved out into open ocean. What happened in the hours and days that followed remains one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in American maritime history. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly, the way these things usually do. When the SS Poet failed to report in as scheduled, it was initially logged as a communication problem. Ships lost radio contact. Equipment malfunctioned. It was not immediately alarming. But then the silence continued. One missed check-in became two. Two became four. By the time a week had passed with no word from the Poet, alarm bells were ringing at the vessel's operating company and within the United States government. A ship carrying 34 Americans and a cargo of aid program grain had gone completely off the grid, and no one had heard a single word from her. The Coast Guard launched a search. The Navy participated. Aircraft swept enormous sections of the Atlantic, scanning for any sign of the vessel or her crew. They found nothing. Not a lifeboat, not a piece of hull plating, not a single personal item belonging to any of the 34 men aboard. The Atlantic in those weeks of searching was absolutely stubbornly empty. What made the disappearance even more disturbing was what investigators did not find: a distress signal. In the age of modern maritime communication, a ship in serious trouble sends a mayday. There are procedures, backup systems, emergency beacons. The Poet sent none of them. Whatever happened to her appears to have happened fast, catastrophically fast. Fast enough that no one on board had time or opportunity to reach for a radio. That single fact changes everything. A sudden catastrophic event. Something that overwhelmed a 522-foot ship and 34 experienced sailors without giving any of them a fighting chance. As the official search wound down and investigators began piecing together the poet's final days, a more troubling picture began to emerge. Weather reports from the North Atlantic in late October 1980 showed a significant storm system moving through the region. Waves reaching 30 to 40 feet, wind speeds that could shred a vessel that wasn't structurally prepared to handle them. And here is where the story gets darker. Internal documents and maritime records obtained in the years following the disaster raised serious questions about the condition of the SS Poet before she ever left port. Questions about maintenance. Questions about whether an aging vessel, a ship built 36 years earlier to wartime specifications, was genuinely seaworthy enough to cross the North Atlantic in late autumn, with a full cargo hold and a crew of 34. These were not minor concerns raised in hindsight. Some of these concerns had been raised before the Poet sailed, and yet she sailed anyway. There is a particular kind of institutional failure that is more horrifying than any single act of negligence. It is the failure that happens slowly, across years and decisions and budget pressures and overlooked inspection reports, until one day a ship that should have been retired is loaded with 13,000 tons of grain and pointed toward open ocean. And the people making that decision tell themselves everything will be fine. For the families of 34 men, it was not fine. It was the last decision anyone ever made on their behalf. The official investigation into the loss of the SS Poet was widely criticized, not just by the families of the victims, but by maritime experts and government watchdogs who looked at the process and found it deeply unsatisfying. The investigation concluded that the most likely cause was structural failure in heavy seas. In other words, the ship broke apart in the storm, but that conclusion raised more questions than it answered. If the ship broke apart, where was the wreckage? A 522-foot steel vessel does not simply dissolve. Cargo containers float. Life preservers float. Personal belongings float, and yet the Atlantic returned nothing. Not one piece of identifiable debris from the Poet or her crew. Investigators who pushed on this point were told that ocean currents could account for the absence of surface debris, that the wreck lay in deep water, that the storm had simply scattered everything beyond recovery. Some of the families never accepted that explanation, and some maritime investigators pointed to something else, something the official report addressed only briefly. In the weeks before the Poet sailed, there had been concerns raised about her cargo loading, specifically about the way 13,500 tons of grain had been distributed in her holds. A ship that is improperly loaded can become dangerously unstable in heavy seas. It can roll, and if it rolls far enough, it does not come back. In the years following the loss of the Poet, investigators, journalists, and maritime historians pieced together a portrait of systemic failure, a failure that extended far beyond one ship and one voyage. The American Merchant Marine in 1980 was operating under enormous pressure, aging fleets deferred, maintenance, economic stress, and regulatory gaps that allowed vessels to remain in service far longer than safety best practices ever recommended. The Poet was not unique in this regard. She was, in many ways, representative of an entire industry that had been pushed to its limits and beyond. Congressional hearings examined the loss of the Poet and produced recommendations for tightening maritime safety standards. Families of the crew testified. Maritime lawyers pursued wrongful death claims, and slowly, painfully, a fuller picture of what may have happened began to emerge, though may have are the operative words, because without the wreck, without the voyage data recorder, without any physical evidence from the ship herself, absolute certainty was never possible. The leading theory remains catastrophic structural failure in the storm system that moved through the North Atlantic. In the final days of October 1980, ship compromised by age and possibly by improper loading. Overwhelmed by seas, she was no longer capable of surviving. An event so sudden and so complete that 34 men died without ever getting the chance to call for help. But there are those who have never stopped asking whether that explanation is complete, whether every document was released, whether every decision made in the days before the Poet sailed was fully examined. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily, and governments, it turns out, are not always eager to help. Decades after the SS Poet vanished, a researcher working through declassified government documents discovered something that had never been prominently reported. In the days immediately following the poet's disappearance, there had been internal government communications that raised the question of whether the vessel's final voyage should have been approved at all, given known concerns about her condition. These communications had not been part of the public record of the official investigation. They had not been shared with the families. When this information became public, it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. For families who had spent years demanding a complete accounting, the revelation was devastating, not because it changed the fundamental facts. The poet was still gone. The 34 men were still dead. The ocean had still given nothing back, but it changed the shape of the tragedy. It transformed a story about a catastrophic maritime accident into something far more disturbing. Story about what happens when institutional systems fail the people who depend on them, when the pressure to keep ships moving overrides the obligation to keep sailors safe. 34 men sailed out of Philadelphia on a gray October morning. None of them came home. That is the fact at the center of this story. Everything else don't. The investigations, the documents, the theories, but is the world trying to explain something that, at its core, may never be fully explainable. The SS Poet has never been found. She lies somewhere, at the bottom of the North Atlantic, in water too deep and too dark for any recovery effort to reach her. The 34 men who sailed with her have no graves. Their families had no closure, no bodies to bury, no final confirmation of what their last moments were like. What the ocean took, it kept. There is a tradition in maritime culture of reading the names of the lost at memorial services, of speaking those names aloud into the open air, because the sea never gave those names back. The men of the SS Poet are remembered this way, in the voices of the people who loved them, in the records of congressional hearings that came too late, in the quiet persistence of families who refused to let the story be forgotten. The next time you are near the ocean, any ocean, and you watch the horizon disappear into gray water and gray sky, think about what is out there. Think about the ships that never came back. Think about the 34 men of the SS Poet who sailed into the Atlantic on an autumn morning and were simply gone. The ocean keeps its secrets, but we are still here, still asking, and that, the asking, is the only dignity we have left to offer them.